on political opponents to pave the way for the unfettered re-election of President Ortega. The authorities carried out arbitrary detentions and spurious prosecutions of opponents. They abolished political parties and also undertook the arrests of presidential candidates. The shrinking of civic space and the full frontal assault on the freedom of expression served to consolidate power in the hands of the executive. The third phase occurred in 2022. One of its chief hallmarks was the elimination of the few remaining pockets of political opposition in Nicaragua. The third phase culminated in arbitrary arrests, deportations, the closure of media channels, and the cancelling of the legal status of thousands of non-profit organizations, as well as of universities and media companies. The attacks targeting the Catholic Church were also ramped up exponentially in this third phase. The fourth phase began in 2023 and continues to date. Not satisfied with silencing any remaining critical voices in the country, the authorities have also sought to exercise control over Nicaraguans living abroad. The authorities have expelled or banned from entry back into the country hundreds of Nicaraguans and have arbitrarily deprived of their nationality at least 453, Nicaraguan citizens. The sheer scope of the recent constitutional reform, which has been in force since it was gazetted on the 18th of February 2025, strikes at the very heart of what should be a division of powers, as well as at the rule of law and the institutional framework of Nicaragua. The content and scope of the aforementioned reform serves to confirm one of our principal concerns, to wit the reality of the total co-opting of the powers of the state in the hands of the executive alone, at the beck and call of a repressive architecture which has a veneer of illegality under the new constitution of the state. Distinguished delegates, as I believe emerges very clearly from the report that we have submitted to you for your consideration and the diagrams contained in the annex of said report, over the last year, state, parastatal institutions and the governing party, the Frente Sandinista para la Liberación Nacional, the FSLN, have merged together in a single machine of persecution wielded against all those who are perceived to be political opponents or dissident voices. Said apparatus has been further entrenched thanks to an extensive intelligence network that spies on the whole population and identifies targets for persecution. A network which provides the eyes and ears that allows the authorities to exercise and maintain complete control over persons remaining in the country. The patterns of human rights violations and the profiles of the victims of those violations reveal a clearly defined and discriminatory objective, to wit, absolute control over the entire population, both within and without Nicaragua, for political ends. Alongside extrajudicial executions, torture, and the arbitrary detentions described as occurring during the first phase of the authorities' operations, we are now witnessing the confiscation of assets, the freezing of pensions, expulsions and deportations, and the arbitrary stripping of nationality, all hallmarks of the fourth phase of the government strategy. In the almost 7 years of this crisis, since the crisis first broke out in 2018 up until today, thousands of Nicaraguans of all ages have suffered a full-fledged assault on their very lives, their physical well-being, their freedom of expression, their education, their nationality, and/or their right to have access to justice, to mention just some of the rights that have been violated and trampled upon. Your Excellencies, the group has reached the conclusion that the repressive apparatus that we have described is directly controlled by President Ortega and by Vice President Murillo, with the direct support also of high-level civil servants in all branches of power, as well as by members of the FSLN government party. The command chains have been designed to resemble and to operate like tentacles, with the intention of guaranteeing direct control over the various links in the chain at the different levels to ensure the enforcement of centralized strategies. The group has reasonable and credible grounds to believe that it will be possible to establish the individual responsible of some of those persons who are acting as nexuses in the command hierarchy, and their names will be duly identified in a session document to be published at the end of this 58th session of the Human Rights Council. Your Excellencies, the human rights situation and the rule of law in Nicaragua have suffered a deep-rooted deterioration. There is an urgent and pressing need for action by the international community, focused in particular on the following points. First, strengthening support for Nicaraguan civil society, including financial and technical assistance to civil society organizations and media companies so that they can withstand state repression. Second, there is an urgent need to pursue accountability measures before the International Court of Justice in response to Nicaragua's violations of its international obligations with regard to the United Nations Convention Against Torture and the cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, as well as under the Convention to reduce cases of statelessness. The third urgent action that the international community should undertake is expanding specific legal measures, such as sanctions targeting individuals, institutions, or entities identified in the reports submitted by the group, as well as those who will be duly identified in the session document to be published before the 4th of April. Fourth, we will call upon the international community to protect those Nicaraguans deprived of their nationality or who have been expelled from the country or whose return to the country has been denied. In particular, we call upon the international community to guarantee the granting of refugee status to these Nicaraguans and a fair asylum process. We would also call upon the international community to facilitate the administrative process for those persons who are victims of the arbitrary refusal to issue their passports or identity documents. Our fifth appeal to the international community is that you take steps to guarantee that human rights considerations are duly integrated in international decisions. Based on the findings of the group, for example, ensure that human rights considerations are duly integrated into the consultations under Article 4 of the International Monetary Fund, in particular as they pertain to recommendation number 8 of the International Finance Action Group. Similar steps could be taken with regard to trade agreements, where we call upon the international community to make full use of human rights conditions. For example, these could be integrated into the free trade agreement between the European Union and Central America. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Merci.
Thank you. I understand that the delegation of Nicaragua is not present in the room. I therefore invite interested delegations to put questions to the presenters and to make comments on the presentation that we have just heard. I recall that the speaking time is limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds for each intervention. The list of speakers is now closed, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. We align with the statement to be made by the European Union, and we thank the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua for their report. We regret Nicaragua's announcement to disengage from the Human Rights Council. The human rights situation in Nicaragua has continued to deteriorate. The recent adoption of legal reforms by the country's legislature will worryingly lead to further human rights violations. We reiterate our concern about the continuous attempts to silence dissent by targeting and criminalizing the opposition, human rights defenders, journalists, as well as students and university professors. Threats, arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, torture, and other forms of ill treatment, as well as citizenship removals, must end immediately. In addition, we are troubled about the lack of protection for victims of rape and the current state of legislation preventing them from accessing safe abortion, including for child victims. Besides constituting a blatant violation of the right to live with dignity, forcing women and girls that are victims of rape to carry their pregnancies to term exposes them to extreme psychological and physical distress, which in certain cases can amount to torture. We urge the government to address the plight of sexual violence and to provide women and girls with adequate abortion services as well as sexual and reproductive health.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. We welcome the group of experts' valuable work. We regret the recent announcement by Nicaragua to leave the Human Rights Council. We remain deeply concerned about the ongoing series of constitutional reforms and dismantling of democratic norms and institutions in Nicaragua, including the deletion of the explicit prohibition of torture. The government must stop the systematic repression and violations against human rights defenders, as well as political, religious and indigenous leaders. The government must secure the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and allow civil society organizations and universities to operate freely and return the property that has been confiscated. We urge releasing all political prisoners unconditionally and cease the practice of forced exile. Citizenship must be restored to persons who have been arbitrarily deprived of it and their safe return ensured. Their legal records, access to bank accounts and confiscated property should be restored to the full. Distinguished experts, how can we ensure the human rights for Nicaraguans and stop the democratic backsliding of the country? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, the European Union thanks the experts for the report, which clearly documents the deteriorating situation of human rights in Nicaragua. The EU will support the renewal of your mandate. We take note with regret of Nicaragua's announcement that they would disengage from the HRC. We are concerned about the rewriting of the Constitution, which is another step away from democracy and the rule of law, consolidating the concentration of powers and further undermining human rights and fundamental freedoms. The EU calls for the end of repression, including transnational repression against dissenting voices, political opponents, journalists, civil society, NGOs and religious institutions. We also call for the release of all those arbitrarily arrested. The EU deplores reports of torture and degrading treatment of these prisoners, the targeting of their relatives, forced expulsion, stripping of citizenship and confiscation of property. We call for the full adherence of international law and obligations. We urge Nicaragua to receive and cooperate with international human rights organizations, the group of experts and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. The EU reaffirms its support to the Nicaraguan people and to all efforts aimed at finding a democratic, peaceful and negotiated solution to the ongoing political crisis. Mr. Simon, what is the impact of the constitutional reform, including the creation of a voluntary police force?
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador on behalf of a group of countries.
Señor Presidente.
President, I am delivering this statement on behalf of the core group on the resolution on the human rights situation in Nicaragua, comprising Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru. We regret Nicaragua's decision announced yesterday to further disengage from the Human Rights Council, stating that it would withdraw and refrain from engaging in any activity related to the mandate of this body. This action constitutes an alarming sign of isolation, an attempt to duck its responsibility with regard to its international human rights obligations. We also deplore the recent reform of more than 100 articles of the Constitution, which has served to undermine the fundamental and core principles of democracy, inter alia the elimination of the principle of respect for human dignity, the separation of powers, the ban on censorship of the media, and the protection from any form of torture. We call upon the Nicaraguan authorities to reconsider their decision to further disengage from this Human Rights Council and its activities, and we reiterate the need for Nicaragua to cooperate fully with international human rights mechanisms, as well as to take urgent steps to restore civic space, to put an end to the perpetration of serious and systematic violations of human rights targeting multiple different stakeholders, and also restore the full effectiveness of human rights in the country in line with the principles of a democratic state and a state in which the rule of law prevails. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on behalf of a group of countries.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. It is my honor to take the floor speaking on behalf of the Group of Friends of the Charter of the United Nations. We would like to take this opportunity as a group to reiterate our categorical rejection of double standards and the politicization of human rights, bearing in mind that such an approach is an enemy to authentic dialogue and cooperation. We also take this opportunity to voice our deep-rooted concern in light of the ongoing and growing proliferation of parallel reporting mechanisms and procedures, which claim to carry out supposedly impartial assessments and evaluations of the human rights situation in given states such as Nicaragua. However, the aforementioned evaluations do not just lack the due consent of the state in question, but also the reports are often based on carefully selected sources that are anonymous, unreliable, and of dubious veracity, biased, and lack any credibility and objectivity, all of which means that those reports end up being mere propaganda pamphlets. The Group of Friends wishes to take this opportunity to reiterate its robust condemnation of the sustained and growing deployment of unilateral coercive measures aimed at furthering an interventionist agenda and a destabilizing agenda, both politically and economically speaking, that has had an inverse impact on the full enjoyment of human rights of the people of Nicaragua. We reiterate our call for a constructive and non-politicized approach to dialogue based on human rights, based on genuine cooperation, mutual understanding, and full respect for national sovereignty and the principle of non-interference in internal affairs. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Mr. President, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the group of experts for their report. We regret Nicaragua's decision to withdraw from the Human Rights Council. We condemn in the strongest terms the widespread and systematic human rights violations committed by the state of Nicaragua, especially its crackdown on civic and democratic space. The human rights situation in Nicaragua shows no signs of improvement. Expulsion of priests and nuns, the removal of the prohibition of torture from the Constitution, the abolition of the division of powers, re-entry bans for an increasing number of citizens, these developments clearly show that Nicaragua is in fact going in the opposite direction. We call on Nicaragua to cease all reprisals against Nicaraguans for exercising freedoms of expression and opinion, assembly and association, and to release all political prisoners. We call on Nicaragua to return citizenship and property rights to those who have been deported and expropriated. We call on all member states to support the mandate renewal of the group of human rights experts. Honored experts, how can we jointly prevent that financing streams contribute to human rights violations in Nicaragua? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. Costa Rica thanks the group of experts for their report, which once again, underpinned by the schematic diagrams it contains, exposes a systematic and targeted pattern of violations and human rights abuses in Nicaragua and the structure of repression and crackdown which has become further entrenched in that country. One of the most alarming findings contained in the report is the ongoing arbitrary stripping of nationality. Hundreds of persons have been stripped of their documents without access to any legal protection as a result, and their goods and assets have been confiscated. They have become de facto stateless persons, facing an uncertain future and without any country to go back to. It is also inexplicable that the ban on torture has been eradicated from the Nicaraguan constitution, a further signal of the very troubling human rights situation in that country. The recent reform of 100 articles of the Constitution has concentrated absolute power in the hands of the executive and eliminated any fiction of an independence of powers in the country. In addition to allowing for persecution and crackdown, this reform has legalized such crackdowns and such repression, leaving many of the population without any protection guarantees. The last vestiges of the rule of law have been stepped away and an unprecedented authoritarianism has taken root. Given this situation, it is vital that the international community ramps up the attention that it pays to the human rights situation in Nicaragua, and that this Human Rights Council continues to wield all the tools at its disposal to bring about positive change and make a positive difference in the human rights of Nicaraguans. Thank you very much.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
I'm much obliged to you, President. We align ourselves with the statement delivered by the European Union. We thank the OHCHR for all their hard work, and we also convey our gratitude to the group of experts for their report, which details the very troubling human rights situation in Nicaragua with a picture of serious violations. The situation has become all the more worse with the constitutional reform, which inter alia has led to an unprecedented concentration of power in the hands of the governing family. To avoid and prevent cases of statelessness, we have granted citizenship to those Nicaraguans who have been arbitrarily stripped of their nationality. And we have also helped to resettle exiled Nicaraguans. But these cannot be long-term systematic solutions. Rather, we demand the Nicaraguan authorities to fulfill their international obligations and to refrain from using the stripping of the citizenship rights of their people as a weapon that they wield against their own population. We regret the fact that Nicaragua has decided to withdraw from the Human Rights Council. It is the third country to do so over the last few days, 3 very significant steps taken. We call upon Nicaragua to put an immediate end to repression, and we reiterate our call for the immediate release of all political prisoners, for the dismissal of their trials or the accusations against them, the restoration of the rights of all citizens, and the lifting of restrictions on civil society. Members of the expert group, what international anti-impunity and accountability mechanisms do you think we should be applying against Nicaragua at this stage? Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la...
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland. Thank you, President. Switzerland thanks the group of experts for the presentation of its report and reaffirms its full support for their mandate. We very much regret restrictions on access to the country and the lack of cooperation by the authorities with international human rights mechanisms. We also regret the decision by the government of Nicaragua to take no further part in the work of this council. We commend the work of the group with a view to establishing responsibility for grave human rights violations that have taken place since 2018, and we call for perpetrators to be brought to justice. We are especially alarmed by the constitutional reform of the 30th of January, which establishes executive power without checks or balances, thereby undermining the fundamental principles of the rule of law. We call on the authorities to re-establish the separation of powers and guarantee fundamental freedoms. We also call for an immediate end to the repression of civic space, closing of media and NGOs, and persecution of vulnerable groups. The authorities must guarantee the rights of persons arbitrarily detained and order their immediate release. Distinguished experts, what are the most urgent forms of support to allow civil society, independent media, and human rights defenders to continue their work? Finally, we reiterate our call on the authorities to collaborate immediately with the OHCHR, the treaty bodies, and the group of experts. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, the DPRK is deeply concerned over the continued and growing proliferation of reporting mechanisms and procedures for so-called assessments of the human rights situation in sovereign states without their consent. It is obviously a selective and politically motivated approach, and it proves itself that it is another attempt to manipulate the Human Rights Council in its own geopolitical interests. We reiterate our support to and solidarity with the government of Nicaragua in its efforts to preserve national stability and reconciliation and guarantee legitimate and democratic institutions through dialogue and cooperation with all relevant stakeholders. We strongly urge the HRC to fulfill its mandate to promote and protect human rights on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation in strict compliance with the purposes and principles enshrined in the UN Charter, without resorting to coercion, selectivity, politicization, or double standards implied by the imposition of these hostile mandates against specific countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Burkina Faso is next on my list, but I don't think the delegate is back yet. So, Chile, are you ready to take the floor? Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Our thanks also go to the group of experts for their update, which is all the more relevant given Nicaragua's decision to withdraw from the Human Rights Council. We deeply regret this step taken by Nicaragua, which prevents the state from meaningfully engaging with the deterioration of human rights in the country and the erosion of democracy. One other step that has struck us as deeply troubling is the constitutional reform, which, in the words of the expert group, represents a de facto dissolution of the division of powers and will have harmful consequences for democracy. We also deeply deplore the scrapping of the ban on torture and the withdrawal of the principle of human dignity as a core and fundamental principle. We also deplore the deprivation of liberty and the deprivation of nationality of many political opponents, which has led to a de facto expulsion from the country and a loss of nationality due to, inter alia, their failure to grant them new passports, etc., a crime which has cross-border impact. We call upon the Nicaraguan authorities to take immediate measures to allow international oversight of the situation in the country and to reconsider its decision to withdraw from the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much.
The distinguished representative of Peru.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. Peru also wishes to thank the group of experts for the submission of their most recent report. We reiterate our deep-rooted concern given the ongoing and sustained deterioration of human rights in Nicaragua. We reiterate our alarm in light of the recent constitutional reform in that country, which further undermines and weakens the rule of law, with a severely adverse impact on the separation of powers, undermining democratic principles. Such steps have had a negative and adverse impact on the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Nicaraguans, in particular vulnerable groups such as indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant persons, and those who have been the victims of gender-based and sexual violence. We also deplore the recent decision taken by Nicaragua to disengage from the Human Rights Council and to refuse to engage with any activity carried out under the auspices of this council. We will always support all efforts aimed at restoring dialogue and understanding between Nicaraguans as a precursor to finding a peaceful and long-term solution to the crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. Uruguay would also like to thank the High Commissioner and the group of experts for the oral update on the human rights situation in Nicaragua. We very much welcome the report submitted by the group of experts as well. We take this opportunity to reiterate our support for the mandates of the group of experts and the OHCHR. We also take this opportunity to voice once again our concern given the prolonged deterioration of human rights situation in Nicaragua, culminating in the most recent changes to its constitution recently adopted, which imperils the fundamental rights and freedoms of the Nicaraguan people and the separation of powers as well as democracy. We have noted with concern the lack of independence as well as the exploitation of the courts and of justice and of law with the purpose of eradicating any vestiges of opposition, whether that be real, potential or perceived as such. We take this opportunity also to voice our condemnation of the crackdown on Nicaraguan citizens and the stripping of their individual freedoms, a clear violation of international human rights law. Uruguay reiterates its call upon the Nicaraguan government to open channels of cooperation and dialogue with the human rights mechanisms and to allow said human rights mechanisms and groups unfettered access to Nicaraguan territory. We also take this opportunity to call upon the Nicaraguan authorities to reconsider their withdrawal from the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the actions taken by Nicaragua are an unmistakable indication of profound failure of this Council. When a nation is pushed to the brink, feeling trapped with no way to escape the suffocating grip this Council has imposed upon us, the only viable option might be to remove ourselves from the equation entirely. We have long tried to call for the Council's mandate to be fulfilled through dialogue and cooperation. The Council should distance itself from politicization, stigmatization, and stereotyping. Politicization of human rights only causes division and confrontation and reduces the human rights into a tool of political agendas. In this context, we oppose initiatives driven by political considerations in the Council that aim to undermine the stability of Nicaragua and obstruct its efforts for peace, reconciliation, combating poverty, and achieving development based on human dignity, and we denounce the unilateral coercive measures directed against it. We emphasize that engagement with the government of Nicaragua and the Human Rights Council must fully respect its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence while upholding the principle of non-interference in its domestic affairs. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia. Error on my list, I apologize. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
President, the Russian Federation notes the unquestionable achievements of the government of co-presidents Ortega and Murillo in promotion and protection of human rights. We categorically reject the politically motivated and irrelevant documents outright condemning Nicaragua for supposed systematic violations of human rights. Their authors deliberately gloss over Managua's success in ensuring gender equality, the rights of ethnic minorities, including indigenous peoples, and workers' rights. In addition, they overlook the positive changes as a result of the socioeconomic transformation. Meanwhile, the constitutional reform adopted by the Nicaraguan parliament has, for the first time in the country's history, enshrined in legislation the socially oriented nature of the state, with guarantees of free education and health care, the rights of citizens to cultural, sporting, and creative development, food security, access to affordable housing, and communal services. We are convinced that the basis for the critical attacks towards Managua is a desire by Western countries to destabilize the domestic political situation in this sovereign state. We consistently advocate for objective, impartial, and depoliticized work in the HRC. We deem it counterproductive to use the Council to exert political pressure on Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to
Mr. President, China welcomes the efforts of the Nicaraguan government in promoting and protecting human rights, including developing national education plan to further protect people's economic, social, and cultural rights. We recognize the country's active participation in the fourth round of UPR and its engagement in constructive dialogue. China always opposes the politicization and instrumentalization of the Human Rights Council and opposes using human rights as an excuse to interfere in other countries' internal affairs. We call on the international community to respect the country's sovereign independence and territorial integrity and respect the right of the people to freely choose their own path of development. We oppose certain countries, without the consent of Nicaragua, forcing through resolution relevant to the country and extending the mandate of country-specific mechanism. The practice can only exacerbate confrontation and does not contribute to better protection of human rights. China urges countries concerned to follow the fundamental principles of objectivity, impartiality, non-selectivity, and non-politicization. Immediately remove UCMs against Nicaragua, stop unfounded accusations against the country, and return back to the right path of dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
President, the report on Nicaragua does not reflect the actual state of affairs in that country. Quite the opposite. The report stems from an interventionist, selective, politicized, and partisan resolution, one which Cuba rejects wholesale. The only effective way to strengthen the protection of human rights in all countries is through dialogue and cooperation. Dialogue and cooperation that need to be based on respect and non-interference in the internal affairs of states. Nicaragua is a victim of the persistent and ongoing siege enacted by the United States and other countries who justify their actions by claiming that they are acting on the grounds of alleged concerns for human rights. This Council cannot allow itself to be exploited as a tool to further political agendas. Cuba supports the efforts of the government and the people of Nicaragua as they seek to pursue sustainable development, peace, justice, and social emancipation. We call for full respect for the sovereignty of Nicaragua and an immediate cessation of the arbitrary and illegal unilateral coercive measures applied against that country, measures which are detrimental to the human rights of its people. Nicaragua has the right to live in peace. The brotherly people of the Sandino can always count on Cuba's unwavering support and solidarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, my delegation thanks the group of experts for the report. The Lao PDR take note of the continued efforts made by the government of Nicaragua in the promotion and protection of human rights and development in the country. My delegation is of the view that the imposition of country-specific mechanisms without the consent of the concerned country is counterproductive and prevents genuine dialogue and cooperation. In this regard, we reiterate our call for a constructive approach to the promotion and protection of human rights based on the principle of impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, and respect for national sovereignty. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Paraguay.
Presidente. Thank you, President. Paraguay would like to thank the group of experts for their report. We take this opportunity to voice our concern on the human rights abuses that it details, as well as the fact that it details the fact that crimes against humanity may have been committed. We regret the recent adoption of a constitutional reform which undermines democratic institutions and has pulled down the safeguards which should protect the Nicaraguan population, instead concentrating all power de facto in the hands of the few, with no longer any separation of powers. We also deeply deplore the campaigns to crack down on any dissident voices and the campaigns wielded by the authorities to crack down on their population, including dissidents and critical voices both within and without the country. We're deeply concerned by the plight of the most vulnerable in society in the world of academia, including universities. The violations and abuses committed in these spheres demonstrate a clear intention by the authorities to control any space which may foster any form of resistance or criticism. We recall that the right to nationality is a fundamental right to be enjoyed by every human being, so the deprivation of that right is a clear violation of international law. Once again, we call upon the government of Nicaragua to fully respect international human rights law. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Mr. President, Cyprus would like to thank the group of experts for its report and express support for the renewal of its mandate. We align ourselves with the EU statement. We deeply regret Nicaragua's decision to withdraw from the Human Rights Council and urge the government to reconsider its position and engage with all human rights mechanisms. The report represents a deeply concerning situation. The consolidation of power embedded in the Constitution into the hands of the very few undermines the very essence of democracy, threatens the rule of law, and severely restricts the protection and implementation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Political pluralism is severely affected, with clear attempts to stifle freedom of expression. Voices of opposition and dissent in all spheres face systemic repression. Arbitrary detentions, ill treatment, torture, and violence against women have unfortunately become commonplace. We support all efforts towards a negotiated, peaceful solution to the crisis. At the same time, we urge the Nicaraguan government to fully comply with its obligations under international human rights law and establish an enabling environment for the protection and advancement of all fundamental and human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union. We thank the group of human rights experts for its report and commend its ongoing work in investigating all alleged human rights violations and abuses committed in Nicaragua. Ireland remains deeply concerned by the human rights situation in Nicaragua, which has deteriorated further in the last year. We condemn the arbitrary detention of those exercising their right to freedom of expression and the reprisals against those former political prisoners and dissidents living in exile, including the denationalization of such individuals. We call on Nicaragua to uphold its international human rights obligations and to end its repression against dissenting voices, civil society organizations, and religious institutions. We further call on the Nicaraguan authorities to release all remaining political prisoners. We deeply regret Nicaragua's announcement that they would disengage from the Human Rights Council. Ireland urges the Nicaraguan authorities to re-engage with international human rights mechanisms, such as the UN Group of Human Rights Experts and the Office of the High Commissioner, and to ensure a safe and enabling environment for all human rights defenders. Mr. Simon, could you discuss the impact that the denationalisation of individuals has had on Nicaraguans living in exile? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Yesterday, Nicaragua declared that it is leaving this council. We want to make it clear that this will not change the need to hold the authorities accountable for the suppression of human rights in Nicaragua. In this spirit, we welcome the report of the Group of Human Rights Experts on Nicaragua. We're alarmed by its findings, including further reports of extrajudicial killings and arbitrary detention. We're concerned that authorities have used physical and psychological violence, including threats, rape, beatings and prolonged solitary confinement against those who participated in the 2018 protests and against individuals who have been accused of publicly criticising the authorities. In addition, the approval of the wide-ranging constitutional amendments passed on 30th of January undermine the separation of the powers of the state and mark a further tragic development in the dismantling of the rule of law in Nicaragua. Moreover, the increase in reports of transnational repression, including intimidation and harassment of Nicaraguans in exile, represents a further attack on human rights. The ongoing limitation of Nicaraguans' civil, political and other human rights is unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Thank you, President. The report presented to the Council today and the activities of the mechanism itself, which was set up without consent from Nicaragua, undermines opportunities for dialogue and cooperation in the sphere of human rights. In November 2024, Nicaragua successfully presented its national human rights efforts under the current UPR cycle. The UPR process has highlighted the undisputed achievements of the country in ensuring the rights of women, enhancing the quality and availability of education, combating trafficking in persons, social support to vulnerable groups, and other areas. These results were achieved in spite of the ongoing unlawful pressure on the country in the form of economic sanctions and other UCMs. The practice of politicization, selectivity, and double standards prevalent in the HRC towards Nicaragua and other developing countries takes a lamentable toll on the work of the HRC, which is steadily losing its authority. We view Nicaragua's decision to reject activity within this council. We view condemnation of this rather as a deep sign of lack of respect. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Georgia.
And we thank the group of human rights experts for the latest report. Georgia remains alarmed over the deteriorating human rights situation in Nicaragua, exacerbated by a multifaceted crisis and significant decline in civil and political rights. We deplore the pervasive and systematic abuses of human rights encompassing arbitrary detentions and killings, torture and ill treatment, along with infringements of the rights of freedom of expression, association and assembly. We deeply regret the recent constitutional reform, which has entered into force in February and represents a further step away from the rule of law, in total disregard of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Furthermore, the ever-growing tendency of persecution of individuals and organizations viewed as adversaries of Ortega Murillo regime remain a serious concern. As a result of these repressive actions, human rights advocates, religious and community leaders, and members of the independent media and NGOs continue to suffer from grave human rights violations. Georgia reaffirms its solidarity with the people of Nicaragua in their relentless pursuit of peaceful resolution of the ongoing socio-political crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Apologies, technical difficulties. Thank you, President. We'd like to thank the group of human rights experts for their update. New Zealand joins others in expressing our strongest concern at the ongoing violation of human rights in Nicaragua, including increasingly severe restrictions on free and democratic expression and political participation. We're deeply concerned by the arbitrary deprivation of nationality,
the increase in political prisoners, instances of torture, sexual violence, and the repression of civil society, religious, ethnic minority, and Indigenous peoples. These instances of repression are taking place against the backdrop of concerning new laws that further limit fundamental freedoms. We remain concerned by Nicaragua's continued failure to respect its international human rights obligations, including its failure to engage with international bodies mandated to monitor human rights. We urge Nicaragua to re-engage with the Human Rights Council and to engage with the recommendations made by the group of experts in their most recent report. We would welcome the views of the experts on how democratic opposition and human rights defenders can be protected from further persecution in Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Thank you, President. The Republic of Nicaragua's withdrawal from the Human Rights Council should serve as a wake-up call for this body. How many times have the countries of the Global South spoken up to denounce the politicization, the bias and the double standards in addressing topics related to human rights? How many times have we denounced the use of the human rights institutions, this body, as a weapon wielded to destabilize countries or a politicized tool to bring about political regime change? How many times have we spoken up to question the allocating of scarce and precious resources for mandates imposed by this council and whose results have been almost non-existent when it comes to cooperation and boosting same for human rights? Perhaps Western countries do not wish to wake up to the reality that maintaining such a course of action, far from strengthening, is weakening this institution and its credibility. This body lives or dies by its credibility and the trust that everybody reposes in its impartiality. This council, unfortunately, has failed to uphold those hopes pinned in it. We respect the sovereign decision of Nicaragua to withdraw from this council, and we hope that this decision will contribute to this council taking time to reflect on its role and the future of human rights. Nicaragua left the Human Rights Council, or was it the Human Rights Council that left Nicaragua? That's the question that needs to be answered. I fear that the spectre of the defunct Human Rights Commission has begun to stalk this chamber. Thank you very much, President.
Do you give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina?
Thank you, President. Our thanks also go to the group of experts for the presentation of their report, which underscores once again the worsening human rights situation in Nicaragua. In the oral update, the Office of the High Commissioner deplored the fact that in Nicaragua a severe and repressive climate prevails, and they sounded the alarm on the serious impact of the ongoing constitutional reform, or ongoing at that time. A few weeks ago said unprecedented reform was enacted and sounded the death knell for the rule of law and the point of no return in the path towards the consolidation of power solely in the hands of the presidential family. The division of powers that was purely fictitious rather than factual is now definitely a thing of the past. The measures and actions undertaken by the Nicaraguan government have severely undermined the right to life, freedom and property of Nicaraguans. The principle of non-interference in internal affairs is wielded as a pretext, used as a shield to hide from view the most aberrant crimes committed against political opponents, against critics and against persons linked to the Catholic Church, encompassing acts of torture, forced disappearances and the complete catalogue of the violations of the most fundamental human rights. For all of the aforementioned reasons, we reaffirm that what should actually prevail is the principle of states not remaining indifferent to such abuses. President, we believe that it's vital that we renew the mandate of the group of experts and the OHCHR. We have not lost all hope that the government of Nicaragua will choose to heed the voice of this council, which, with a few regrettable exceptions, speaks with one voice, calling on the government to once and for all care for and protect their very own citizens, those who are prepared to lay down their own lives and the well-being of their own children for the good of their future generations and the nation itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you much. Colleagues, Ambassador, this is no disrespect, but I had a meeting with the translators, interpreters yesterday, and they explained to me that they need you to speak at a not too fast speed, so they are able to provide interpretation with the quality they want to deliver, and we request. So if you can, please. I know I'm very harsh on the time limits. We have a very loaded work program, but nevertheless, please try to keep it within a speed that is also good for the interpreters. Thank you very much for considering that. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Sri Lanka appreciates the efforts of the government of Nicaragua in advancing the rights to education and health and improving the living condition of its people. Action taken by Nicaragua to mitigate the impact of climate change is also noteworthy. Sri Lanka believes that country-specific initiatives which do not enjoy the consent of the country concerned are not helpful in achieving the objectives of this Council. Such measures are against the universal principles of respect for integrity, sovereignty, and non-interference in the internal affairs of states as enshrined in the UN Charter. Sri Lanka reiterates that the mandate of this Council needs to be operated through genuine dialogue in order to achieve meaningful advances in human rights. It is also recalled that the UNGA Resolution 60/251 that sets up this Council recognizes the importance of ensuring universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues and the elimination of double standards and politicization. We therefore encourage the Council to engage with the government of Nicaragua in a constructive approach to safeguard the human rights of its people. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
President, Zimbabwe reaffirms its position against the adoption and implementation of politically motivated Council resolutions that target specific countries. This approach is counterproductive and it ignores the concerns of the targeted country and seeks to impose solutions on a government that has a key role in the promotion and protection of the human rights of its people. We call on the Council to prioritize a genuine, constructive, and non-politicized dialogue with the government of Nicaragua, and that such dialogue should be guided by the principles of objectivity, impartiality, non-selectivity, and non-interference in the affairs of the state. The dialogue should hinge on cooperation to support and strengthen the country's efforts towards fulfilling its human rights obligations. Zimbabwe condemns the continued application of unilateral coercive measures which have a devastating impact on Nicaragua's development efforts and the full enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights by its people. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen by video.
Mr. President, the Republic of Yemen expresses its appreciation to the OHCHR for its report and to the group of HR experts for the oral update, and commends the efforts of the government of Nicaragua in promoting human rights and its initiatives to empower women and promote their participation in public life. We commend the government of Nicaragua's efforts in terms of health and education. We urge Nicaragua to create a free and safe environment for journalists and activists, and to continue working towards guaranteeing the right to peaceful assembly and free expression, which contributes to strengthening the democracy and protecting civil rights. We are confident that Nicaragua will continue its efforts in promoting and protecting human rights and meeting the aspirations of its people. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, Ukraine appreciates the comprehensive report presented and expresses its deep concern regarding the ongoing systematic and widespread human rights violation in Nicaragua. The alarming constitutional reforms that concentrate excessive power in the hands of the executive undermine democratic principles and dismantle institutional checks and balances. The erosion of judicial independence and the instrumentalization of state institutions for political persecution further exacerbate the country's crisis. The suppression of civil society, the closure of independent media, and the arbitrary revocation of legal status of the thousands of non-profit organizations illustrates the government's intent to eliminate dissent. Particularly disturbing are the increasing cases of politically motivated arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, and the documented use of torture, including sexual violences, against those demand opponents of the government. Additionally, Nicaragua's continued disregard of international law is evident in its maintenance of so-called honorary consulate of Nicaragua in the temporarily occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea Crimea in violation of UN General Assembly resolutions and fundamental principle of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ukraine stands with the international community in calling for full accountability for those responsible for crimes against humanity and urges Nicaragua to cooperate with international mechanisms. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor.
While arbitrary detentions, forced disappearances, the persecution of dissent, and violation of fundamental freedoms still persist in full impunity. We ask the authorities to cease all harms, grant reparations, and ensure the respect of human rights for all Nicaraguans. Recently, the UN Committee on Human Rights found that Nicaragua violated Articles 6 and 7 of the ICCPR. We uphold the committee's request to the authorities to combat sexual violence, ensure comprehensive health education and services for girls, and guarantee effective access to remedies for victims. Last November, Nicaraguan authorities participated in the UPR process. Yet, they continue to deny the access to the country and to refuse the cooperation with human rights monitoring mechanisms. We've taken note with regret of Nicaragua's choice to disengage from the Council, and we hope this to be reconsidered. Esteemed experts, are there any prospects of change within the justice system in Nicaragua, bearing in mind its fundamental role in the restoration of democracy? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Mr. President, the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms should be guided by constructive dialogue and cooperation, based on the principles of non-politicization and non-selectivity, and considering the concerns of the concerned states. Reports and approaches that are prepared in a biased manner add no value to the Human Rights Council's mandate of supporting states in promoting human rights. Instead, they deepen the gap between the states and the Council and its mechanisms, ultimately undermining the effectiveness of the Council's work in a counterproductive manner. The people of Nicaragua have the right to determine their own national policies. They should not be subjected to hardship due to external pressures and foreign interference. Their fundamental human rights, particularly their economic, social, and cultural rights, should not be jeopardized by the imposition of unilateral coercive measures. Despite the pressures caused by external interference, the Nicaraguan government has demonstrated its independent will to uphold the right of its people to self-determination, safeguard its national sovereignty, and protect the human rights of its citizens. This must be fully respected. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Burkina Faso.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Burkina Faso salue l'engagement du Nicaragua à promouvoir et protéger les droits de l'homme sur son territoire. Ma délégation salue les efforts consentis par le gouvernement du Nicaragua en vue d'améliorer les conditions de vie des populations à travers, entre autres, le renforcement des services sociaux de base tels que l'éducation, la santé, le logement, ainsi que la mise en place d'une politique devant garantir la sécurité alimentaire dans le pays. Mon pays estime que ces efforts méritent d'être reconnus et accompagnés par la communauté internationale dans le strict respect de la souveraineté et des priorités du pays. Ma délégation tient à rappeler que l'imposition de mandats non consensuels et motivée par des considérations politiques est contre-productive et contraire à l'esprit et aux principes fondamentaux du Conseil des droits de l'homme. Enfin, le Burkina Faso appelle à la responsabilité du Conseil des droits de l'homme quant à la nécessité de promouvoir un climat de dialogue sincère et co-constructif, seule condition capable d'instaurer la confiance et de garantir la pleine coopération entre les États et les mécanismes des droits de l'homme. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Nous passons à la liste des institutions nationales des droits de l'homme et des organisations non gouvernementales. Et je donne la parole à Right Livelihood Award Foundation par vidéo.
Mr. President, the Right Livelihood thanks the group of human rights experts for their report and for the attention given to indigenous peoples. By allowing illegal cattle breeding, logging, and mining by the colonos on indigenous lands, the Nicaragua government is an accomplice in human rights violations. They are bringing the indigenous and Afro-descendant communities on the Caribbean coast on the brink of ethnocide. In 2024, only over 1,000 human rights violations were reported, including widespread violence and documented cases of abduction targeting specifically women and girls. This has led to widespread forced displacement. We condemn that, instead of standing by its obligation and promptly investigating the crimes, the government continues the suppression of critical voices, targeting human rights defenders inside and outside Nicaragua. And it has engaged in a campaign to strip indigenous peoples of their land rights. Besides establishing parallel authorities in previously protected lands, the recent constitutional reform has restricted self-determination rights, the exercise of autonomy, and the right to communal property and natural resources. Mr. President, as the repression intensifies and the government succeeds in suppressing critical voices, the group of experts is vital in documenting Nicaragua's continually deteriorating human rights situations to ensure that justice is ultimately served. We therefore urge the Council to renew the mandate of the GRAN, strengthening its provisions on indigenous people and ensuring that they are provided with adequate resources to fulfill their fundamental role. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Center for Justice and International Law, also by video.
Excelencias, desde SEGIL y la Unidad de Defensa Jurídica agradecemos el trabajo del Grupo de Expertos en Derechos Humanos sobre Nicaragua. Valoramos sus conclusiones y recomendaciones, en particular aquellas relativas al impacto de las decisiones internacionales sobre el acceso de recursos del gobierno en un escenario donde la reciente reforma constitucional concentra el poder del Ejecutivo y restringe libertades fundamentales. Observamos con profunda preocupación la situación de las 47 personas presas políticas en Nicaragua y el patrón reforzado de desapariciones forzadas con 12 víctimas registradas. En particular, alertamos sobre el caso de Jaime Navarrete, preso político desde hace 7 años, cuya salud se ha deteriorado gravemente en un contexto de hostigamiento y aislamiento. En este sentido, quisiéramos conocer el nivel de implementación de las recomendaciones del grupo de expertos. Finalmente, instamos respetuosamente al Consejo a renovar el mandato del GREM por 2 años y a redoblar los esfuerzos para garantizar la liberación de las personas presas políticas y su acceso a la justicia a nivel nacional e internacional. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Protestant Agency for Diaconia and Development.
Buenas tardes. Como miembro del colectivo de Derechos Humanos Nicaragua Nunca Más, agradecemos al Consejo su labor frente a la mayor crisis de derechos humanos en nuestra historia reciente. El retiro de Nicaragua del Consejo de Derechos Humanos es de suma preocupación, ya que esperan que retirándose de todo espacio de disertación política o derechos humanos, sus crímenes sigan en impunidad. Con la salida de este Consejo, de la Organización de Estados Americanos y la ruptura diplomática con 6 estados, pretenden impedir que la comunidad internacional siga denunciando la ruptura del orden constitucional, la imposición de un estado de excepción de facto y una política de torturas y destierros. Tan solo nuestra organización ha documentado 229 casos de tortura y 161 personas apátridas de facto, caracterizada por destierros silenciosos y selectivos, impedimento de ingreso a Nicaragua o la negativa de entregarles sus documentos, sentenciando a muerte civil a miles de nicaragüenses. Agradecemos el informe del grupo de expertos y hoy más que nunca es necesaria la renovación de su mandato, al igual que el del alto comisionado. Además, hacemos un llamado para activar a la Corte Penal Internacional, cuya jurisdicción le permite investigar los crímenes extraterritoriales, como la deportación y persecución, los cuales se han terminado de cometer en estados parte del Estatuto de Roma. Hoy más que nunca no debemos callar. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Aula Abierta.
Buenas tardes, señor presidente y miembros del Consejo. Junto a RID y la Red Pro de Paz Nicaragua denunciamos la continuación de la política de Estado contra la libertad académica y la autonomía universitaria en Nicaragua. En 2025 hemos documentado denuncias sobre la radicalización del adoctrinamiento político institucionalizado en las universidades, las cuales han sufrido por años injerencia del Ejecutivo a través del Consejo Nacional de Universidades, consolidados con reformas que eliminaron su autonomía. Esta realidad se agrava con la reciente reforma constitucional promovida por el Ejecutivo y aprobada por la Asamblea Nacional, que subordina derechos fundamentales a los valores supremos de paz y seguridad, conceptos indeterminados utilizados arbitrariamente para justificar violaciones de derechos humanos. Así, la producción y difusión de conocimiento crítico en ejercicio de la libertad académica quedan en riesgo y en extinción forzada. La reforma también establece que quienes promueven la injerencia extranjera serán considerados traidores a la patria y perderán su nacionalidad, aumentando el riesgo de privación arbitraria de la nacionalidad para defensores de derechos humanos, universitarios y críticos del Estado que participan en instancias internacionales, como ha ocurrido a más de 400 nicaragüenses. Estas reformas también generan graves preocupaciones sobre el Estado de Derecho y los grupos vulnerables como los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes. Instamos a los Estados a exigir al Estado de Nicaragua el cumplimiento de sus obligaciones internacionales. Asimismo, urgimos la renovación del mandato del grupo experto en derechos humanos.
My earlier remark on the speed of your statement also concerns civil society representatives. Of course, please respect that. I give the floor to International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
Gracias, presidente. En nombre de la FIDH, de Urnas Abiertas y del CENID, agradecemos el importante informe del grupo de expertos que da cuenta de cómo se ha ido consolidando una maquinaria unificada de represión en Nicaragua bajo el control de Daniel Ortega y Rosario Murillo. Desde hace casi 7 años, Nicaragua atraviesa una profunda crisis que, lejos de mejorar, ha intensificado las políticas estatales de represión. En estos años, el país también ha experimentado un deterioro en los índices de transparencia, evidenciando un modelo de corrupción sistémica que no solo ha limitado el acceso a servicios y derechos de la ciudadanía, sino que ha reforzado ese sistema de represión. A inicios de 2025 se aprobó una reforma constitucional que destruye el Estado de Derecho, y el retiro de Nicaragua de este Consejo es una prueba más de la falta de voluntad del Estado de Nicaragua de querer solventar esta grave crisis. Por ello, el acompañamiento a las víctimas y a la sociedad civil nicaragüense, así como el monitoreo por parte de la comunidad internacional, es aún más fundamental y necesario. Así, respaldamos las recomendaciones del grupo de expertos, entre otras la rendición de cuentas de los responsables de violaciones y crímenes documentados, y que los estados e instituciones financieras internacionales incluyan garantías de derechos humanos en proyectos de cooperación e inversión. Instamos a este Consejo a aprobar la extensión de ambos mandatos por 2 años más. Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Peace Brigades International.
Gracias, señor presidente. Estimados miembros del Consejo de Derechos Humanos, soy Wilmer Gutiérrez, Ortega de Nicaragua. Quisiera externar la preocupación de los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes por la aprobación de una constitución considerada lesiva para nuestros pueblos. Nicaragua es signataria del convenio 169, sin embargo, la nueva constitución carece del proceso de libre información previa informada hacia los pueblos. Nicaragua celebra 200 años de independencia y pese a varias iniciativas no hay una ley que tutela los derechos de los pueblos indígenas del Pacífico centro y norte del país. Nuestros pueblos aún demandan justicia por la Navidad Roja, la invasión de colonos sobre los territorios titulados causa muerte, desplazamiento y exilio. Desde el año 2015 hasta la fecha se reportan más de 80 comunitarios asesinados. El Estado de Nicaragua tampoco ha cumplido con el proceso del saneamiento establecido en la Ley 445 ni el ejercicio efectivo de la autonomía. Dicho esto, Nicaragua necesita de un marco jurídico estable que no sea manipulable ni socave la integridad de los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes en el país. Toda constitución debe de respetar los derechos de estos pueblos que existen antes del Estado de Nicaragua. Estos derechos son imprescriptibles. Agradecemos el trabajo del grupo de expertos y solicitamos la continuidad de su mandato. Muchísimas gracias, presidente.
Thank you. I give the floor to World Organization Against Torture.
Mi nombre es Eugenia Valle Olivares, esposa de Víctor Boitano Coleman, ciudadano italo-nicaragüense, que fue arrestado en nuestra vivienda el 23 de abril del 2024 por parte de agentes armados y policías. Los policías no contaban con orden judicial. Desde ese día que irrumpieron violentamente en nuestro domicilio, desconocemos su paradero. Durante 6 meses me dediqué a la búsqueda de mi esposo en distintos centros de reclusión. Sin embargo, ninguna autoridad nos proporcionó información sobre su paradero y estado de salud. Ante las amenazas y persecución que sufrí por parte de agentes estatales, como resultado de la búsqueda de mi esposo, tuve que abandonar el país. Desde entonces me encuentro en exilio. Pese al temor y desesperación que vivimos, quienes tenemos a nuestros familiares desaparecidos y detenidos, hoy vengo ante el Consejo de Derechos Humanos a alzar mi voz en nombre de esas 47 familias de presos políticos que han y siguen siendo torturados en las cárceles de Nicaragua. Les pedimos seguir fortaleciendo todos los mecanismos necesarios, como el grupo de expertos, para que algún día podamos regresar a Nicaragua y vivir sin miedo. Exigimos fe de vida de mi esposo Víctor Boitano, así como de Angélica Chavarría y Brooklyn Rivera. Exigimos que se haga cumplir al gobierno de Nicaragua las medidas cautelares y las medidas provisionales que se han instado en la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to International Service for Human Rights.
Buenas tardes. Tras la reforma constitucional entrada en vigor el 19 de febrero en Nicaragua, todas las garantías ciudadanas han sido canceladas, incluido el derecho al recurso de habeas corpus, el principio de legalidad penal, el derecho a no sufrir torturas, y se ha eliminado toda disposición que refiera a la dignidad de la persona humana y su respeto, un principio jurídico de la humanidad por más de 75 años. El espacio cívico se ha cerrado y criminalizado. Hoy hay 47 personas presas políticas en las cárceles desprovisto de todo tipo de derechos. De estas, Fabiola Tercero, Brooklyn Rivera, Nancy Enríquez, Leo Cárcamo y otros activistas se encuentran en estado de desaparición forzada. Manuel Urbina, Jaime Navarrete y Marvin Vargas continúan en la cárcel a pesar de que han cumplido sus condenas. La prisión política se utiliza para imponer el miedo a la ciudadanía y a los presos políticos como ficha de negociación. Asimismo, centenares de activistas sufren restricciones de movimiento. Deben presentarse diariamente a estaciones policiales sin orden judicial ni juicio previo. En los primeros 2 meses de 2025, más de 200 ciudadanos han sido impedidos de regresar al país, convirtiéndolos en apátridas de facto. El Estado de Nicaragua incumple de forma deliberada así sus obligaciones internacionales. Miembros del grupo de expertos, agradecemos su invaluable trabajo desde la concertación democrática. ¿Cómo podemos desde la sociedad civil colaborar para asegurar la continuidad de su mandato? ¿Cuáles son los obstáculos a la implementación de sus recomendaciones, en especial sobre las instituciones financieras internacionales y el apoyo internacional a la sociedad civil? Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Cívicos.
Estimados miembros del Consejo de Derechos Humanos y del Grupo de Expertos, la nueva constitución impuesta por el gobierno de Nicaragua, que reforma más del 60% de los artículos, no fue consultada a la ciudadanía, por lo que carece de legitimidad. El artículo 45 de dicha constitución restringe el derecho a la libertad de asociación, obligando a las organizaciones a integrar en sus naturalezas y fines los llamados principios fundamentales. Preocupa que el gobierno de Nicaragua pretenda poner a los instrumentos internacionales subordinados a la Constitución, como lo señala el artículo 182. El gobierno de Nicaragua continúa cerrando el espacio cívico del país. Esto ha significado el cierre arbitrario del 80% de las organizaciones existentes. Muchos de los programas de desarrollo y atención de los grupos vulnerables no han sido sustituidos por el Estado. Han expropiado el patrimonio de las organizaciones y sus miembros continúan siendo criminalizados. Por tal motivo, el Cívicos Monitor considera como cerrado el espacio cívico de la sociedad civil en Nicaragua. Por último, pedimos la liberación inmediata de al menos 8 guardabosques indígenas y defensores del territorio que fueron detenidos y condenados de forma arbitraria por el gobierno de Nicaragua. Agradecemos el trabajo riguroso y sistemático del grupo de expertos y de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado. consideramos necesario la continuidad de su mandato y solicitamos el respaldo de los estados. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ingénieur Dumond, also by video.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to express gratitude for the work of the United Nations Group of Experts on Nicaragua. Their latest report is a milestone in exposing the full scale of repression. For the first time, it is explicitly recognized that the Nicaraguan army played a direct role in the violent crackdown of the protests, engaging in extrajudicial executions and providing intelligence and weapons to paramilitary groups. This is a truth that other human rights organizations and I have denounced for years. At least 450 of us have been stripped of our nationality, but the real number of stateless Nicaraguans is far higher. Thousands have been denied re-entry to our own country. And religious persecution also continues. Over 50% of the Catholic clergy has been forced into exile, and entire Protestant communities are also being harassed. Ortega continues to shut down independent organizations while confiscating private properties. The newly imposed constitution has dismantled the separation of powers, abolishing fundamental human rights protections and cementing a grotesque concentration of power in the so-called co-presidency. This council must go beyond documentation. I respectfully urge this body to explore alternative international mechanisms to hold perpetrators accountable.
Merci. C'était la dernière intervention qui nous est possible d'écouter. Je donne maintenant la parole au groupe d'experts pour leurs remarques finales. Il vous reste 8 minutes 35 secondes. Et je comprends que c'est Madame Ariela Peralta qui va prendre la parole. S'il vous plaît, Madame.
Agradecemos a todos los estados intervinientes y por razones, y agradecemos las preguntas, por razones de tiempo me voy a referir a algunas y mi colega Reed Brody se va a referir a otras. Respecto a la pregunta del Estado de Alemania, para nosotros es importante que se lleven a cabo diligencias debidas y exhaustivas que incluyan evaluaciones de impactos sobre los derechos humanos antes de invertir o conceder préstamos a entidades en Nicaragua utilizando nuestros informes y otras fuentes fiables, y que la ayuda financiera o los préstamos se condicionen a mejoras en el récord de derechos humanos en el país. Ante la pregunta del Estado de Rumania sobre el sistema de justicia, la reciente reforma constitucional subordina el sistema de justicia a la presidencia, formalizando la cooptación de los tribunales y el Ministerio Público por parte del Ejecutivo a través de los secretarios políticos del Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional colocados en sus filas. Ya el Poder Judicial estaba cooptado por el Poder Ejecutivo. Esta Constitución viene a formalizar y el grupo de trabajo ha documentado todas las líneas de actuación que dan órdenes a través de los secretarios políticos a la Procuraduría y a los distintos tribunales de justicia. En este sentido, las perspectivas no son alentadoras. Por eso el grupo urge a la comunidad internacional a tomar acciones concretas que mi colega Reed Brody va a explicar con más detalles. Para el grupo, en relación a la pregunta del espacio académico que hizo Bélgica, los Países Bajos y Luxemburgo, para el grupo actualmente una medida importante es que los estados, en los casos en que se encuentran exiliados nicaragüenses o con otro estatus legal, y en esos países en que hay estudiantes que no han podido acceder a su récord universitario, profesores que se han quedado sin salario y o pensiones, entonces que los estados proporcionen soluciones creativas que permitan a estas personas continuar sus estudios, se les reconozcan sus títulos profesionales o récord universitarios, que puedan reiniciar su trabajo académico, que puedan obtener becas u otros medios de vida para fortalecerles y fortalecer la futura independencia académica y entonces esas juventudes para el retorno a la democracia en Nicaragua. Sobre la pregunta de Irlanda sobre el impacto de la desnacionalización, tenemos que considerar que el grupo de trabajo considera la desnacionalización una suerte de muerte civil, ¿verdad? Hablamos de apatridia de derecho o de apatridia de facto para personas que de hecho están sin documentación y sin derechos como nacionales, y esta desnacionalización implica la violación conexa de otros derechos, entre otros, voy a nombrar solo algunos: participación en los asuntos públicos, libertad de circulación y escoger la residencia, violación de la personalidad jurídica y violación a los derechos de los niñas y niños. La desnacionalización ha implicado, por casos documentados por el grupo, la imposibilidad de reunificación familiar de padres con niños y niñas, las violaciones por extensión a los familiares y a las personas que aún quedan en el territorio de Nicaragua, y la muerte económica de estas personas por la confiscación de todos sus bienes. Cómo ayudar a la sociedad civil también lo va a abordar mi colega, pero un aspecto importante es lo que ya iniciamos diciendo en nuestro statement, que es el apoyo con ayuda económica y técnica para que la sociedad civil, que está dispersa y atomizada por la represión, pueda fortalecerse para una transición y un retorno lo antes posible a la democracia en Nicaragua. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. As we state in our report, the international community must not simply bear witness, but take concrete measures to hold the government and the individual perpetrators accountable. To answer Spain's question about accountability, if there is one thing we would advocate, it would be for a state or a group of states to hold Nicaragua accountable at the International Court of Justice under the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. There is no country in the world today that practices arbitrary deprivation of nationality for political reasons on the scale that Nicaragua does. The new Constitution explicitly provides for the revocation of nationality for those deemed traitors to the homeland. Who are those 453 people already called traitors? 7 opposition political candidates, one of whom we just heard from, former Sandinista heroes, former Vice President Sergio Ramirez, journalists, community leaders. All of them have also been expelled from Nicaragua, except for one, Donna Vilma Nunez, at 86 years old, the dean of the Nicaraguan human rights community, who remains in Managua, stripped of her citizenship, her property, her pension, and her law license. As Nicaragua's withdrawal yesterday from the Council shows, the government has nothing but disdain for international monitoring mechanisms. But the ICJ is a forum that Nicaragua cannot dismiss or discredit. Since its historic case against the United States in 1984, no country has brought more cases to the ICJ than Nicaragua. Its record at the court is a rightful source of national pride for the Nicaraguan government. A case at the ICJ would have real meaning. The evidence of statelessness is irrefutable, found in government decrees, official orders, and now in the Constitution itself. And the ICJ can order provisional measures that would have real-time impact on the situation. Turning to Switzerland's question on support for human rights defenders, the abrupt termination of a major source of foreign assistance has severely undermined Nicaraguans striving to hold their government accountable, including exiled human rights activists, independent journalists, and activists. Many Nicaraguans, NGOs who had planned to attend this session had to cancel their participation. And the Nicaraguan government lost no time in celebrating. State-controlled media gleefully reported that, and I quote, Donald Trump turned off the faucet to the terrorists. This is a moment for other states to urgently step up and fill the gap to support those courageous Nicaraguans who continue to stand up for fundamental rights. Many delegations have asked about the new Constitution. Under that Constitution, the co-presidents have enhanced powers to suspend rights in a state of emergency, summon the military to take on police actions, and deploy the new so-called voluntary police, who this month took their oaths with their faces masked. Among other provisions, the reform deletes the explicit constitutional prohibition of torture and eliminates the ban on censorship of the press. In conclusion, Nicaragua has become a place of surveillance and enforced silence for those who remain, while those who dare to resist or who are merely suspected of doing so face a life of statelessness and exile. Thank you.
Merci. Ceci nous amène à la fin de ce dialogue interactif. Je tiens à remercier les membres du groupe d'experts des droits de l'homme sur le Nicaragua pour leur participation. Nous faisons une courte pause avant de commencer le dialogue interactif sur la mise à jour orale du haut-commissaire sur la situation des droits de l'homme au Myanmar. Merci.